And now to Kabul, Afghanistan, where violence against civilians has risen in the first 6 months of 2013, with insurgents striking in areas where troops have already left. A report presented by the Human Rights Director for the United Nations in Afghanistan said the number of dead and injured civilians had increased by nearly 23%. Now, women and children are increasingly the victims of the 12-year-old war. There's a 30% leap in the number of children specifically killed, and the total civilian death toll stands at more than 1,300. According to the report, nearly three-quarters of civilian deaths were caused by insurgents who were increasingly targeting civilians seen to be cooperating with the government. And in the worst instance, 10 children, most of them infants, were killed in an aerial bombardment in the eastern province of Kunar that appeared to serve no clear military or tactical purpose. The threat to civilians has become a significant source of stress in relations between Karzai and his backers, particularly when civilian deaths are caused by foreign forces. Still, questions have been raised about the ability of domestic forces not only to take on the insurgents, but to win the trust and support of people in areas where they operate. And joining us to discuss all of this is Heather Barr, senior Afghanistan researcher for Human Rights Watch. Heather, thank you for joining us. I want to ask you, people have a perception, here in America and really everywhere, that the war is ending, yet the casualties seem to be rising, especially for women and children, as we mentioned. Why is that?
Well, it's a false perception. The war isn't ending at all. The involvement of the U.S. military, the involvement of other international militaries is wrapping up, but the war is not ending.
And when we talk about the war not ending, I mean, the numbers from 2011 were seen as the high point in terms of casualties. But are the numbers from this year even greater? I mean, does this have anything to do with the U.S. pulling out? What can we say about the causality between the U.S. pulling out and those numbers that we're seeing?
Well, it had been suggested before that with the departure of the international troops, the conflict would de-escalate. And I think we have enough information now to know that that's not the case and that's not happening. 2011 at the time was seen as being perhaps the peak of the violence, with an expectation that the violence was going to decrease afterwards. Looking at the figures now, it seems more likely that, in fact, 2012 was some sort of a lull in the violence. And what we're seeing now is a return to the level that may be typical from here on out. It's been suggested that what happened in 2011 was not that the Taliban were being beaten, but that they made a tactical decision to sort of sit back for a bit, given that the withdrawal of the international forces was moving forward no matter what.
And as you know, in war, when we talk about human rights violations, death is obviously the most obvious and perhaps most drastic. But what are you concerned about as a researcher when it comes to human rights with the withdrawal and the high number of civilian casualties?
Well, obviously, this has all kinds of effects. There are more than 500,000 Afghans who've been displaced by the conflict, 60,000 of them just in the last 6 months. We see record numbers of Afghans leaving the country, people looking at how they can get their families to safety outside of the country, people moving around within the country. And it really just speaks to what the future is going to look like in Afghanistan and for Afghans. And one of the things that's really harmful, I think, is that because there's such a strong perception outside of Afghanistan that this war is ending and the troops are leaving and the international media is leaving as well, what we may see is continuing and perhaps escalating levels of violence, but less and less interest outside of the country and less concern about hearing that that's going on.
Certainly, with Iraq, obviously, it's exactly what's happening, and many people drawing that comparison. Just this month alone, 700 people killed in Iraq. So perhaps there's reason to fear that what you're suggesting might happen actually very well will. I just want to share with everyone, this is the photo of the day, la photo du jour from the AFP. This is a woman marching in a cemetery in Kabul, perhaps highlighting the death toll. Hopefully a conversation we can continue to have, and I want to thank you for joining us.